All right. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada on the part of Elizabeth's Royal Navy succeeded in shifting the balance of power, naval power, in not just England, but Europe as a whole. It was at this point that let's say, the Elizabethan era, the golden age of exploration began. And this meant that explorers were seeking new lands, new territories, new wealth under the name of their rulers, in this case, their queen, Elizabeth. Um, and if you click the hyperlink in the slide under Elizabeth's name, you'll watch a short clip on YouTube in which and perhaps they weren't quite as good looking centuries ago, but you'll see Kate Blanchett playing Elizabeth I and some famous actor, I can't remember his name, playing Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, some of the famous explorers that sought new lands and new wealth were, for example, Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and watch the clip. It's kind of a fun one. The movie itself is perhaps not entirely historically accurate, but still gives a vivid depiction of what Elizabeth might have been like. The golden age of exploration. Move to the next slide. All right, now we've moved on to the next bullet point, the next point of learning. We've talked about Henry VIII, Protestants and Catholics, and let's not forget Anglicans, Elizabeth I, and now we move into really looking at how England became such a major player on the world stage in terms of trade and certainly naval power. How did England get so rich? Well, as we've learned, uh, due to this powerful navy, which further grew and developed under Elizabeth's reign, initially to repel the Spanish Armada, um, exploration began. And this ushered in the golden age of exploration. Um, okay, some of the famous explorers, as we mentioned, Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh. I mean, certainly there weren't only English explorers out there representing their, their queen. There were Spanish forces and Spanish conquistadors, explorers doing their thing as well in areas like South America. Um, Essentially, the point was that although Elizabeth didn't have the money to fund a global campaign to colonize territory, um, and she really it couldn't be openly attacking Spanish or Portuguese territories. She could certainly subsidize foreign ventures by backing and sponsoring people like Raleigh, and this would bring profit back to the English crown. So, interestingly, in 1607, and this is something we'll begin talking about in subsequent weeks in class when we talk about the New World, the colonies, the founding fathers. And in 1607, the first colony was established in Virginia, in what is now America. Um, why was it called Virginia? There was no Queen Virginia. Well, again, if we think back, her nickname was the Virgin Queen. So, in her honor, Virginia was established. As well, Newfoundland and parts of Canada were also claimed as territory. So, this began the exploration of the New World. The Navy protected these trade interests, and companies like the East India Company uh, led this further expansion in the new colonies. Move to the next slide. Okay, we're continuing to talk about England's growth, how the country became so rich. And what we see at this point is we're now basically in the, let's say, the 1600s. This was the beginning of capitalism as we still sort of see it today. We have an economic system that is based on personal ownership, right? It's not about communities. It's about capitalists, that people own capital, people own wealth. We have a middle class that actually has capital to invest. And this leads to things like, banks and the creation of capital through stock exchanges and what are known as futures markets. Anyone who has studied economics knows that futures, or commodities that are meant to be profitable in the future, is also part of stock and a tenet of capitalism. We have what are called boom and bust cycles. So commodities which are at the time extremely profitable, ridiculously so in some cases, and then there's an economic boom, and then these commodities then become either valueless, and go bust, or are not being traded. So, for example, you could think of tulips in the Dutch market. For a time, tulips were off the charts, ridiculously profitable and very trendy. And then, during the boom was followed by a bust, in which this sort of market collapsed. Okay, what was at this time one of the tradable commodities? Well, slaves. Now, what was happening in places like South America with Spanish conquistadors that had been using indigenous, native peoples as slave labor? Well, but these folks were dying of disease. The the native populations were not immune to the kinds of diseases that were coming from Europe, and were dying at a rapid pace, tragically. So, okay, we need a new source of cheap labor. So, where do we get them from? Africa, right? So, this was part of let's say, the triangle of trade across the ocean between the colonies and Europe. Other things that were being traded were, for example, tobacco. Okay, in places like Virginia, this is kind of the backbone of American capitalism and the growth of wealth in the 13 colonies. Things like gems, gold, right? Hemp, another plant, a profitable commodity for making rope and sails. Okay, move to the next slide. In continuing to talk about how England got so rich, well, we're now beginning to see during let's say, the 17th century, the first stages of capitalism, as I described in the previous slide, when merchants become involved in the production of goods by supplying materials and paying wages to laborers. Merchants made this switch or this transition, actually, to what we now know as a capitalist system, in that these merchants were the owners of the means of production, to use a Marxian phrase from Karl Marx. They made profit by owning the means of production. We began to see urbanization, people moving from the countryside to make wealth, to make money, and moving to the cities where this was more opportune. There was more opportunity. We began to see the growth of factories. So we're starting to see now the beginnings of, as we'll get to in the next slides, the Industrial Revolution, that the growth of factories and mass-produced goods requires cheap labor. This sort of labor class becomes a poor to middle class. Capitalists being the bourgeoisie, right, the owners of the means of production, and then you have the laborers and the working class who work for the capitalists. These working classes suffered very poor labor conditions. Again, it was such a new concept, right? We're seeing the death of what was known as the cottage industry. That is, everything that people made prior to this point in at least this part of the world, in Europe and England, was made in the home or in the community. Now we're seeing mass production on a mechanized, larger scale. And thus, there was no notion at the time of, say, employee or workers' rights. So conditions were exploitative and uh, awful. And we also see child labor becoming part and parcel of this capitalist system. And the countryside taking less importance as people urbanize and move to cities to make their wealth. Move to the next slide. Okay, this next slide deals with not just England's growth as a global power, but the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Now, one question we would ask ourselves is, why did this move to a more industrial society happen in Great Britain? Well, it began in about 1750, 1760, and there were a number of factors that sort of led up to providing the conditions for society becoming more industrialized. There was what was known as an agricultural revolution. Uh, and so people were better fed. Um, there was better nutrition to some, I mean, at least relative to that time. And if people are better fed, then they're more capable of laboring, let's say. The population could be fed at lower prices, and thus there was also a surplus of food. And then this extra income, this surplus, could be used to buy manufactured goods. So you've got supply and demand, right? Two of the basic tenets of economics and well, capitalism. Okay, you also had financial institutions like banks becoming prevalent in Britain, and let's say a culture of entrepreneurship. People were taking risks in terms of, seeking economic prosperity and growth. And as a result, uh, there were they were moving away from cottage industry, so handmade crafts, and moving toward increased efficiency and mass producing goods. Also, the fact that in England, coal was available, and especially in the north, cities like Manchester, Birmingham were beginning to grow in population at this point because of coal mining. So this use and abuse of natural resources, coal, led to steam technology, so the steam engine and more steam-powered machinery. This also led to the use and abuse of cheap labor. As we said, there were no real workers' rights at the time. And move to the next slide. Okay, now as we see in this slide, we're now into, and we'll talk more about this next week, the Victorian age, the Victorian era, that is named for Queen Victoria, another iconic, very powerful ruler in England who had quite an influence on, well, the development of England. Okay, child labor was an issue. Again, in order to fuel this increased efficiency and mass production in industry, there was a need for cheap labor. Children were available, although this wasn't an invention of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, child labor has been an issue all over the globe forever, basically. But it really grew more prevalent and common in pre-industrial and industrial Britain because you have all these new factories, coal mines, in desperate need of labor, and sort of also you need labor. You need people who are, let's say, uneducated, who just perform menial tasks repeatedly. And there was thus a surge in child labor. Now, of course, this presented an ethical problem that was later tackled in the establishment, I think in 1870, 1878, relatively late, in fact, of the abolition of child labor, that children under 10 were not allowed to, work in such conditions. And of course, there was also a shift in the time for, interesting to teachers and educators, that the notion was that children had a right, an inalienable right as humans to education, right? Um, Move to the next slide. Okay, so in talking about, for example, the notion that people have rights, which is a concept that we take very much for granted, especially in our part of the world nowadays. Well, this was something new, something quite novel back in, let's say, the Victorian era and before. Okay, so if we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, which again started in about 1760, what led to the Industrial Revolution? Well, again, change is slow in human history. There had to be preconditions that existed for generations that led up to a change in thinking or a change in societal behavior, right? This was the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, which began in the late 17th century with Isaac Newton, Roger Bacon, John Locke, René Descartes, these philosophers, these thinkers, who posited something quite radical at the time. And you've also got the history in the Netherlands also plays a huge role in rational thinking, the Age of Enlightenment, with thinkers like Spinoza, for example, who posited these sort of heretical, radical ideas that the world can be understood by reason, observing, analyzing, thinking, and most importantly, reasoning. So these thinkers challenged traditional means of understanding that were based in religion, faith, superstition, and the supernatural. And instead, these philosophers promoted knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge through what was known as a scientific method. So you have empirical data, that is, you observe what's in front of you, and you measure that data, and this gives you a scientific basis in evidence to understand your world. Again, we take this quite for granted nowadays, but at the time, this was quite a new concept. Move to the next slide. All right, cool. Let's keep talking about the advent, the growth of the Industrial Revolution in terms of the preconditions and the origins of what made it possible. So we see here this is Isaac Newton, right, who, came up with this radical concept of observing and making conclusions based on empirical data in front of one. So again, enlightenment or the rationalism, this sort of thinking was based in the notion that the natural world is bound by universal physical laws. Again, not supernatural, not God-given and or based in religion, but that our universe can be understood through observation and reasoning. So the universe is materialist and mechanistic. There's a physical reason to explain why things happen or how they happen. If you're interested, look up Halley's Comet as one of the first instances of, people's thinking beginning to shift based on not assuming that something had things are happening as a punishment from God, but that there's a physical reason why something is happening. It's a universal in a scientific law. Look up Halley's Comet. Move to the next slide. Was there resistance? I mean, you can imagine that these ideas were quite new, quite radical, quite dangerous, right? Industrialization, that the world itself is something that we can understand through human reasoning, right? This was heresy for many. But as the Industrial Revolution began to take hold and society and life began to change for many, there was also a resistance on the part of poets, musicians, um, writers, authors, um, artists. This was an artistic movement known as Romanticism, and this took place in Britain and Europe between, say, 1770 and 1850. It was, as is written on the slide, a violent response or refutation to what was being seen in what was happening in society because of industry and urbanization. So politically, what this romantic artistic movement was inspired by revolutions in America and France. We'll talk in a moment about the French Revolution. And basically, it espoused or expressed the idea that the self and the value of personal experience and emotion is actually the most sort of beautiful and the most worthwhile. So we're talking about, for example, Wordsworth, William Blake, uh, Lord Byron, Shelley, some of the seminal literature that we still the canon that we still read to this day, was came about during the period of the movement of Romanticism. And again, the idea was that the natural and the countryside um, was the most beautiful and the most worthy of human, let's say, ideal. Move to the next slide. So I've taken the liberty of including one of my very favorite works of literature, which is Frankenstein. And actually, the original title was Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. If you're curious, look up, do a bit of research on who Prometheus was in Greek mythology. So, as many of you know, Frankenstein was written by Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley. Um, she wrote it at the young age of 18. I think she was 19 when she finished it. It was published in the early 1800s, or 1818. And the notion, so Frankenstein brings up some very interesting sort of romantic ideas that, while questioning whether scientific exploration is a good thing. It also brings up the notion that the abuse of power in a society can be harmful to the human condition. Um, this idea that people were rejecting God, that humankind, was attempting to play God, right? And this is very much one of the main concepts or ideas in Frankenstein. Okay, so moving away from religion and a respect for God and moving toward mechanization, the machine, and humans playing God. Again, all these sort of romantic responses to what was happening at the time are very interestingly depicted in Shelley's, Wollstonecraft's work. Move to the next slide. All right, we're nearing the end of our journey. We've traveled centuries in time in this PowerPoint presentation, and we're coming up upon, well, we need to talk about the French Revolution. Again, these sort of revolutions in thought had a great impact on Europe, and specifically, we're interested in how did this influence and impact Britain. Well, the French Revolution began in 1789. And as many of you know, the notion was, well, the preconditions to the revolution were the fact that the common folk in France at the time, in mid to mid 1700s were living under very poor, difficult conditions, while the nobility, the royal upper class, were eating cake, while the poor had no bread. You know that old adage of Louis XIV, Marie Antoinette, living in Versailles, this very opulent and grandiose palace, right? Whilst the people, especially in the big cities, were starving and living in squalor. Okay, so the revolution in France was brought about by thinkers who put forth the notion that, and again, a very radical concept at the time, um, égalité, right? Equality. People are equal. We're created equal in the eyes of God, and we have an inalienable right. And this will come back as we talk about the Declaration of Independence in America. The French Revolution and these sort of radical notions of equality had a huge impact on the founding fathers and the development of the United States of America. Okay, so the notion that people are equal and should have equal rights to happiness, to live a good life, to be, protected from the elements, to be fed, even to be educated. Um, and the notion of fraternité, that people are in this together, that we share a fraternity, we need to take care of each other, if you will. So essentially, this was a very tumultuous period in which many people were beheaded. This was also the advent of the guillotine, right, which was seen as actually, ironically, a very humane way of putting people to death. We can talk about that further if you're interested. But in essence, this French Revolution had an impact in Britain because, again, Britain and France had this long-standing um, contentious history. So Britain feared an invasion, right? A bloody revolution, that these ideas would travel across the channel, and the peasantry in Britain would get these notions of revolt. There was also this worry about atheism, as we saw in, for example, Frankenstein. The idea that people were no longer believing in God and God's ultimate power, but taking on godlike powers as humans. Women's rights would explode, right, and become a thing. So, how did Britain or the British system respond? Well, the Napoleonic Wars. War was an outcome. There was a return to conservatism, including a more religious, devout mindset. Women's rights suffered as a result. Radicals were imprisoned. This was a time of change in Britain as well. All right, move on to the next slide, and we're just about wrapping up. Okay, so what we see in this lengthy list are the names of former British colonies. The 13 colonies, right? Sudan, Burma, Jamaica, Singapore, Hong Kong, and an amazingly, let's say, a large portion of the globe, which were colonized by Britain. And as a test or a quiz for yourself, look at a world map. There's one in the next slide, but that also gives you the answers. Where are these colonies to be found? And in placing them around the globe, do you notice any sort of geographical patterns? When did these colonies gain independence? It's also very interesting. I'm going to wrap up the PowerPoint, have a look at the next slides, and when we return and we see each other in person, we'll talk more about trade, global trade, colonies, independence, and we move across the Atlantic to begin talking about American history. I thank you for listening. I hope this has been enjoyable, and see you soon.